Have you ever stood in a village where the ground never truly dries, where every step sinks slightly into soft black mud, as if the earth itself were breathing, where church bells do not ring to comfort, but to remind you that some things are not meant to sleep? In places like these, the wind is not merely cold. It carries the scent of ancient forests, rotting leaves, extinguished candle wax, and freshly turned soil. At night, when light disappears from the narrow dirt roads, the howling of wolves in the distance is not just the sound of wild animals. It is a signal, an ancient whisper echoing across centuries, telling you that the boundary between the living and the dead has never been secure. This is Eastern Europe, and here death does not always mean departure. In the collective memory of these communities, the dead do not vanish. They change position. They leave the dinner table, but not the house. They leave the bed, but remain in the shadows of the room's corners. There are relationships that death is not strong enough to sever, and it is this belief that gives birth to the deepest fear. Those fears are not written in books. They survive in old diaries, parish records, trembling testimonies of those who lived through it, and in rituals performed only when no other explanation remains. After a funeral, there are signs that outsiders rarely notice. A door opens by itself at night when there is no wind. A dog refusing to cross the threshold of a house where someone has just died. A wife waking every morning with the sensation that something has been sitting on her chest all night, leaving bruises no one can explain. At first, they are only sensations. Then they become patterns. In many villages, people carefully recorded what happened after the burial. Not out of curiosity, but out of fear. Old notebooks describe the same troubling sequence again and again: illness spreading within the dead person's family livestock, weakening without cause, children screaming in the night. After dreaming of the deceased standing beside their bed, no one calls it a haunting. They call it a sign, because in this worldview, memory is not something that exists only in the mind. Memory is a force. If it is strong enough, bitter enough, unresolved enough, it can anchor a soul in place, refusing to let it move on. A person who dies with unspoken words, unresolved betrayal, or deep resentment does not fade easily. Death to them is merely a change of state, not the end of presence. That is why the greatest fear is never a stranger who dies in the village, but a loved one. A husband, a mother, a child. They know your name. They know your habits. They know where you sleep and what makes you most vulnerable. If someone returns, it will not be an unfamiliar ghost. It will be a memory wearing a human face. Folk records reveal a chilling consistency. Disturbances rarely begin immediately after burial. They come days later, weeks, sometimes 40 days, a period many communities believe the soul still wanders uncertain of where it belongs. During this time, the living must be careful. Mirrors are covered. Windows remain shut. Candles are kept burning through the night. Not to provide light, but to show the way. Because if a soul becomes lost, it will return to the place it knows best. And that place is always home. There are accounts of nights without moonlight, when footsteps are heard in the yard, not hurried, not heavy, but familiar, slow, certain. When the door is opened, no one is there. Yet the ground near the doorstep has sunk slightly, bearing faint impressions that do not clearly belong to either a person or an animal. To the modern mind, all of this can be explained. Wind, animals, grief-stricken imagination. But for these communities, logic alone does not provide safety. Because when an entire family weakens together, when identical dreams appear in multiple people, when a dead person's name is whispered from the mouths of sleeping children, coincidence is no longer convincing. It is a bond that has not been cut. Some communities believe death is simply a relocation of existence. The dead do not leave the world. They move beyond where light can reach. And if they are not guided properly, if rituals are performed incorrectly, if farewells are incomplete, they will find their own way back, not out of malice, but because they do not know where else to go. The true terror in this belief is not the monster, it is familiarity. What returns is not foreign. It wears a known face, It carries a familiar voice. It knows how to stand in the dark without being seen. It knows when the living are weakest. And because of that, the first to be haunted are not the brave or the strong. They are the ones who remember the most, the ones who have not let go, the ones still living inside memory. When memory refuses to die, who is truly the one being haunted? When memory refuses to die, who is the first to be haunted? In many parts of Eastern Europe, the answer does not point to the spirit. It points to the community, because in this worldview, not every death is considered valid. Some deaths are seen as unfinished, misaligned, or incomplete. And from that gap, the Strigoi emerges. A Strigoi is not a monster in the conventional sense. It is not a creature born to spread terror. In folk memory, a Strigoi is first and foremost a human being, someone who once lived among the village, who had a name, a family, a place within the social order. Only after death are they called something else. A Strigoi is someone who died the wrong way. Wrong not because they committed murder or some great crime, but their death did not align with what the community believed to be proper. Death that came too suddenly. Death marked by resentment. Death accompanied by words left unspoken, or sometimes simply death that occurred under the suspicious gaze of those left behind. In old villages, death does not automatically grant rest. It must be confirmed, not only by priests or religious rites, but by the silent consensus of the entire community. When that consensus fails to form, death becomes dangerous, and that danger is often planted early. It was believed that some people were marked from birth, not by an obvious curse, but by small, unsettling signs. A child born with a thin membrane covering the head, an infant who grows teeth before its first month, a seventh son born in an unbroken line of sons. These signs do not lead to open rejection, but they are not forgotten. They are remembered, quietly stored away, as details without meaning, waiting to return when something goes wrong. Those children grow up. They live, love, argue, and make mistakes like anyone else. But when they die, those forgotten details are pulled back into view. What was once dismissed becomes evidence. The Strigoi does not appear while the person is alive. It appears when memory is re-examined through fear. In many communities, guilt is not believed to end with the individual. It can flow through bloodlines. A family that once produced a restless dead or was suspected of carrying dark influence is watched differently for generations. Each death that follows is no longer an isolated event, but part of a pattern, and that pattern teaches people to wait. The greatest fear is not that the Strigoi will return immediately, it is the time before it does. The days and weeks after a funeral pass under quiet vigilance. No one says what they are thinking, but everyone is watching. An illness appears in the dead person's family. A child dreams of the deceased, standing at the foot of the bed. An animal grows aggressive or refuses to go near the house. In folk logic, the Strigoi does not need to reveal itself. When these signs appear often enough and align too closely, the conclusion has already been reached. What makes the Strigoi terrifying is not its appearance, but its suspended state. It exists as a possibility, always hanging in the air, an unspoken warning, something everyone fears, but no one dares to name. And this waiting distorts the relationship between the living and the dead. The family of the deceased enters a prolonged state of tension. They are grieving and afraid, because if anything goes wrong, they will be the first to be blamed, not because they caused the harm, but because they were closest to the dead. In recorded accounts, the Strigoi does not always return as a walking corpse. Sometimes it is only a heaviness in the air, a presence that makes the living feel watched, drained, as though something unseen is quietly siphoning their strength. People describe sleepless nights, pressure on the chest, and recurring dreams with the same face. No bite marks, no blood, only a slow exhaustion spreads from one person to another. In this belief, the Strigoi does not hunt. It depletes. And when these conditions persist, the community begins to act, not with panic, not with chaos, but through observation, whispering, and gradual agreement. When enough people believe that something is wrong, the Strigoi has already been born, even if it has never appeared. This is the most frightening moment of all, because from here on, death no longer belongs to the individual. The dead lose the ability to defend themselves. Their memory is reshaped, reinterpreted, burdened with new meaning. Kindness fades. Old conflicts are magnified. A once living person is replaced by a dangerous possibility. In this way, the Strigoi is not just a supernatural fear, it is a mechanism of control. A way for the community to preserve order by deciding who is allowed to rest and who is not. And when a community believes it has the authority to make that decision, death is no longer an ending. It becomes an interval, a period of trial, a suspended sentence. If a community decides who may rest in death, then does death still belong to the individual at all? If death no longer belongs to the individual, then the first place to bear the consequences is not the graveyard, it is the home. In the stories that have been passed down, the Strigoi does not begin with screams or a figure appearing in the night. It begins quietly, almost harmlessly. A lingering fatigue no one pays attention to, a mild illness with no clear cause, sleep that no longer restores. The family of the dead is always the first place where change appears. At first, they feel only exhaustion. Once, healthy people grow heavy and sluggish, as if rest has lost its purpose. They wake with the sense that something has been taken from them during the night, but they cannot name it. There are no marks, no sounds, only a slow, steady weakening. The first nights pass in silence. A child complains of recurring nightmares. A wife wakes in the dark with the feeling of pressure on her chest. An elderly relative begins to say they hear familiar footsteps in the hallway. No one thinks of the Strigoi immediately. They think of grief, of tension after the funeral, of the body reacting to loss. And it is this reasonableness that allows everything to continue. In folk belief, the Strigoi is never in a hurry. It does not need sudden violence. It survives by clinging to old bonds. The family is where it feels most at home, where memory is strongest, where no one wants to believe that danger is present. The exhaustion spreads through the house, but unevenly. There's always one person weaker than the others. That person is usually the one most attached to the dead, the one sleeping closest to their former room, the one keeping their belongings, the one who speaks to them most often in their thoughts. In many accounts, people say the house itself begins to change, not visibly, but in feeling. The air grows heavier. Daylight seems insufficient. Candles burn out faster than usual. Animals become restless, avoiding certain corners of the rooms, but the family remains silent. This hesitation does not come from ignorance. It comes from love. Because to admit that something is draining the life from the household is also to admit that its source may be the person they once loved. Someone was recently buried. Someone is still being mourned. No one wants to be the first to say it aloud. No one wants to turn the memory of a loved one into a threat. So they endure. They hide the nightmares. They conceal illness from the neighbors. They convince themselves that everything will pass. In many stories, this period is when the Strigoi becomes strongest, not because it acts violently, but because no one resists. The family's silence becomes a perfect shield. The house turns into a closed space where vitality is drained, slowly unnoticed. Some families only realize something is wrong when it is already too late, when one person becomes seriously ill, when children stop eating, when the dreams no longer merely repeat, but begin to match with terrifying precision. The same face, the same voice, the same call. In this belief, the Strigoi does not need to touch you. It only needs you to remember it. Love, the thing that once held the family together, becomes the weakness. Those who remember the most are the ones who weaken first. Those who keep memory alive are the ones most easily harmed. And eventually the family can no longer hide what's happening. Neighbors begin to notice the change. Doors open less often. Familiar faces grow thin. Once strong people move slowly as if carrying an invisible weight. Questions begin to surface softly at first. Why does your house seem so tired lately? Did something happen after the funeral? The family usually denies it, but their eyes no longer convince. In small communities, exhaustion cannot remain hidden for long. It becomes the subject of whispers. Old stories are recalled. Signs from the dead person's life are re-examined. Details once ignored suddenly matter, and at that point, the Strigoi is no longer a private fear. It becomes a concern of the entire village. The most terrifying moment is not when the village speaks. It is the moment just before. The moment when the family understands that love is no longer a shield, but may be the very reason everything is getting worse. When they realize that protecting the memory of the dead may mean endangering the living. Many describe this as the most painful moment of all. Not because they fear the Strigoi, but because they are forced to choose between two irreconcilable loyalties: devotion to the dead or protection of those still alive. In this world, love is not always safe. Sometimes it is the door through which the thing no one wants to face is allowed to enter. And when the family can no longer bear the weight, when exhaustion can no longer be hidden, when the village begins whispering the same name, the next stage no longer belongs to them. From that moment on, the Strigoi no longer belongs to the house. It belongs to the community. And the question is no longer whether the dead can cause harm. It becomes at this: are we afraid of losing those we love, or afraid of admitting that they might be capable of harming us? When the Strigoi is no longer the story of a single family, when the village begins whispering the same fear, people often look toward the graveyard. But in many parts of Eastern Europe, there is another place that is older, deeper, and far harder to control: water. The rivers that pass through a village carry more than water. They carry memory. They move through generations of the living, quietly recording what was forgotten, what was never spoken, what was never allowed to be named. In folk belief, the earth may conceal, but water does not. Water keeps everything. And when injustice finds no place to stand on land, it follows the current and sinks. In these regions, water is never considered neutral. A river may sustain a village, but it can also remember what the village tries to forget, especially the deaths of women. Deaths that happen in silence, without accusation, without judgment, without anyone willing to say that something was wrong. Women who die unjustly rarely leave clear traces. There are no wounds spoken of, no stories written down, only disappearance. A young woman who never returns from washing clothes by the river. A wife was found drifting the next morning. A body pulled from the water without ceremony, buried quickly, so that everything can be over. But in folk memory, those deaths do not end. The Rusalka is not born from rage. It is born from prolonged silence. In the stories passed down, the Rusalka is not a water being from the beginning. It was once human. A woman abandoned, betrayed, silenced, or killed without being heard. When she sank beneath the surface, it was not only her body that was pulled under, but her story as well. And the water kept that story. People believed that rivers, ponds, and marshes were places where collective memory was compressed. What could not be spoken on land whispered beneath the surface. What was never acknowledged searched for another way to be remembered. The Rusalka then is not a lost spirit. It is memory that has found a shape. In many legends, the Rusalka appears at very specific moments: when the water is still, when the moon reflects clearly, when the world is quiet enough for the living to begin hearing themselves. There is no screaming, no immediate violence, only a strange, familiar pull. Men tell of hearing a voice call their name, not urgently, not threateningly, just a gentle invitation, perfectly timed. A voice that understands their exhaustion, understands their loneliness, understands the weight of what they have never said aloud. The allure of the Rusalka does not lie in beauty. It lies in the feeling of being understood. In closed communities where emotions are rarely expressed, the Rusalka represents the most dangerous thing of all: attention without judgment. presence without demand, a whisper that says your pain is real. And that is what makes it lethal. Folk stories rarely describe the Rusalka attacking. Instead, they speak of people who walk into the water themselves, slowly, calmly, without struggle, as if they had been waiting for that moment. At a deeper level of belief, the Rusalka does not act alone. Beneath the surface exists the Vodyanoi, not as a clearly defined god, but as an invisible root, an ancient force bound to water, to retention, to submersion. The Vodyanoi does not need to appear. Its presence is felt through unnatural currents, sounds beneath the surface, and places people instinctively avoid. The Rusalka is the surface, the Vodyanoi is the depth. In this view, water does not kill. Water only receives what has already been pushed down. The deaths of women, the untold stories, the injustices denied space on land, all gather below, waiting until they are strong enough to rise. And when the Rusalka appears, it is not an invasion. It is memory resurfacing. What is most disturbing is that the village usually knows. They know which stretches of river to avoid, which ponds no one approaches after dusk, which places are never named aloud, but they rarely explain why. As if naming it would give the memory more power. The silence continues, and it is that silence that feeds the Rusalka. It is no coincidence that the Rusalka is so often tied to deaths without justice, unequal relationships, broken promises. Emotions are suppressed until there is nowhere left for them to go. When social space does not allow speech, water becomes the final archive. The Rusalka does not return to take revenge in the simple sense. It returns to be heard. Those who hear the Rusalka describe the same feeling, familiarity, as if they are speaking to a fragment of their own memory, something long buried. And when they step into the water, it is not merely temptation, it is a surrender to something they cannot face on land. In this logic, the Rusalka is not a monster of water. It is the consequence of silence allowed to last too long. And its story leaves one question that many communities have never answered directly. If injustice is never spoken, never heard, never acknowledged, then how will it find a way to be listened to? Water does not forget. It only waits. Water does not only wait. There are times of the year when it begins to answer. After long months of silence, as spring slips into early summer, villages along the river enter a period no one names directly, but everyone recognizes. The elders change their routines. Children are called home earlier than usual. Tasks connected to the water are postponed, even though no one explains why. This is the week of the Rusalka. Not a festival in the usual sense, but not a time of avoidance either. It exists on the boundary between fear and reverence, between what must not be touched and what cannot be ignored. During these days, people believe the line between shore and water grows dangerously thin, and the water begins to speak. At first, nothing is frightening. On the contrary, everything becomes unnaturally beautiful. The river lies calmer. Moonlight reflects with unusual clarity. The trees along the banks appear greener, as if nourished by an unseen force. The air feels light, carrying the scent of damp grass and wildflowers. Beauty arrives before disaster. In folk accounts, this is when the Rusalka rises from the depths, not to attack, but to be present. People say songs can be heard at night. No one knows from where. No one knows who sings. Only that the sound is unlike any human voice. It is not loud, not high, not low. It dissolves into the air as if the night itself were whispering. Those who hear the singing do not feel fear at first. They describe calm, a strange sense of relief, as if someone has finally spoken the words they have carried inside for too long, and it is that feeling that makes it dangerous. During this week, old rules are repeated. Do not bathe in the river after dusk. Do not call another person's name near the water. Do not let children play alone along the bank. But rules only work when they are fully believed, and not everyone believes. Children are the ones most easily called, not because they are weak, but because they have not learned suspicion. In many stories, children hear the voice more clearly than adults. Not a stranger's voice, but a familiar one. The voice of someone who once cared for them. The voice of a sister, a mother, a woman from the village who disappeared long ago. There is no panic, only curiosity. Children who follow the song do not run. They walk, slowly, as if returning to a place they know. And when adults realize what has happened, it is often too late. Only footprints remain near the water's edge. The river's surface lies flat again, as though nothing ever occurred. In folk belief, the Rusalka does not pull people into the water. It makes them step into themselves. This week does not affect humans alone. Nature shifts as well. Small repeating disturbances unsettle the village. The river rises without rain. The current reverses briefly. Fish appear dead along the shore in the early morning. People say this is when nature answers, not with fury, but with response. As if the water is returning what was given to it, memories, stories. The village never truly confronted. During the week of the Rusalka, no great festivals are held, but no one remains entirely indoors either. Colored ribbons are hung not for decoration, but as markers. Wreaths are set upon the water, not to memorialize, but to soothe. Old songs are sung softly, almost under the breath, their words unclear, yet always circling themes of return and release. This is the most conflicted moment, fear intertwined with reverence. Because deep down, the village understands that the Rusalka does not appear without cause. It does not emerge from nothing. It is nourished by what has been ignored. And during this week, the water does what people have not done. It remembers aloud. Those who disappear during this time are not always found. And when they are, there are rarely signs of violence, no clear wounds, no marks of struggle. As if they chose that ending themselves. This is what complicates the fear. It is no longer only the fear of being harmed. It is fear that something inside answered the call. After the week passes, the village returns to normal. The water recedes, the singing fades, work resumes, but no one believes it is truly over, because what has been named cannot be fully forgotten again. The Rusalka does not need to appear all year. It only needs a brief moment to remind everyone that the water is still listening, and the question remains suspended, without a clear answer on those nights when the song rises from the still surface of the river. Who is truly calling? Whom is the water calling to humanity? Or is humanity finally calling back to the memory it has never dared to face? After the week of the Rusalka passes, the water grows quiet again, but the fear does not disappear. It simply changes direction. If water is where memory is submerged, then the forest is where memory waits. Not silent like the river's surface, not seductive like a song. The forest stands openly dense and unmistakable, never hiding the fact that it is a boundary. In many parts of Eastern Europe, the forest does not merely surround the village, it faces it like another presence governed by its own laws, requiring no human consent. And deep within those woods, there is a name that is never spoken carelessly: Baba Yaga. Unlike the Strigoi or the Rusalka, Baba Yaga is not born from an unjust death. She is not a forgotten memory, nor a soul held in place. Baba Yaga exists as something older, a force not bound to humanity, yet understanding humans well enough to be dangerous. Baba Yaga is not evil. She is not good either. In the legends, Baba Yaga does not hunt. She does not lure. She does not need to call anyone's name. Those who find her are always the ones who step into the forest on their own. And that is the most important detail of all. No one meets Baba Yaga by accident. They meet her because they want something the village, the church, or the community cannot give them: knowledge, an answer, another path. Baba Yaga's house does not stand still. It turns. It shifts. Raised on chicken legs, it turns its back on those who are not permitted to enter. In folk logic, this is not a strange embellishment. It is a warning. Knowledge does not wait. It does not open itself to everyone. Baba Yaga does not teach. She tests. Old stories often describe Baba Yaga as an elderly witch, but the image misleads. What is frightening is not her appearance, but the way she asks questions. Baba Yaga offers no clear advice. She does not define right or wrong. She watches how humans behave when there are no instructions. In many tales, those who enter the forest seeking Baba Yaga are desperate. A mother trying to save her child, a young person searching for a way to reverse fate, someone seeking understanding of what no one in the village dares to say aloud. They come not from curiosity, but because they have no alternatives left. And Baba Yaga always gives them a chance, but a chance never comes with a guarantee. Her three roles are never clearly separated. She may test, reward, and punish sometimes, all within the same encounter. There are no warnings beforehand, no explanations afterward. The outcome depends entirely on how the visitor responds. A dishonest answer may lead to death. An act of patience may open a path. A selfish desire may be fulfilled in a way no hunt one anticipates. Knowledge in Baba Yaga's world is never free. The trials she sets are often small. Sweeping the house, tending the stove, sorting seeds. But this is not labor. It is an examination. Baba Yaga does not care how strong you are. She cares whether you notice, whether you respect the order of a world that does not belong to you. Those who fail do not do so for lack of strength. They fail for lack of awareness. In the stories, those who pass Baba Yaga's tests rarely return unchanged. They may carry strange objects, prophecies, or paths leading to what they sought, but in exchange, they lose innocence. A familiar part of their humanity is left behind in the forest. Because true knowledge does not merely answer questions, it alters how you see the world. This is where Baba Yaga differs completely from the beings before her. The Strigoi is a product of the community. The Rusalka is memory drowned. Baba Yaga is a boundary. She does not appear because humans have failed. She exists to see what humans will do when they are given a choice. The forest in this role is not refuge. It is a testing ground. All familiar rules are suspended. Names, status, and social morality lose their meaning. What remains is how you act when no one is watching. And when someone leaves the forest, if they leave at all, they are no longer the same person. In folk memory, Baba Yaga does not need to chase humans. She only needs to open the door. Those who have seen what lies beyond it can never fully return to their former lives. Knowledge once given, whether small or vast, always carries a cost separation. Those who return to the village are changed, quieter, looking at the world with unfamiliar eyes, as if they have glimpsed a deeper layer of reality that cannot be fully shared, and the community senses it. They do not ask many questions. They simply know that this person has crossed a threshold not meant for everyone. Baba Yaga does not need to be worshipped. She does not need to be feared in the usual way. She represents a colder truth. Not all knowledge is meant for humans. Some things once known make a person unfit for the world they came from. And the forests keep such things not to protect humanity, but to preserve a deeper order. Across these stories, from the Strigoi to the Rusalka, and now to Baba Yaga, fear slowly changes shape. From the return of the dead to the call of memory, and now to the invitation of knowledge. Each step deeper demands more and leaves less behind, and the final question no longer points toward monsters or spirits. It points back to humanity itself. Is knowledge always meant for human hands? Or are some doors placed not to be opened, but to test whether we know when to turn away? Those who leave Baba Yaga's forest rarely carry any visible marks with them. No wounds, no magical symbols, no curses clinging to their skin. On the surface, they appear unchanged. They walk the same village paths, speak the same names, recognize the same faces. But in ancient communities, where collective memory is sharper than reason, change does not require proof. It is felt. At first, the differences are small. They pause longer before answering. Their gaze lingers on familiar objects, as if seeing through them instead of at them. During gatherings, they still sit among others, yet always seem slightly out of sync, arriving a moment too early or leaving a moment too late, as if no longer aligned with the village's shared rhythm of time. Baba Yaga does not keep anyone. Folk stories are consistent on this point. She does not imprison, chain, or enslave those who enter her forest. Anyone who steps inside may return. But what they bring back is not something that can be set down at the doorstep. It is not knowledge in the ordinary sense, not a clear answer to a specific question. It is a quiet shift in how the world is understood. Those who return no longer see the village's order as something self-evident. Customs once believed to be immutable reveal themselves as fragile agreements between people. Not wrong, but no longer sacred beyond question. And this realization creates a fracture, not large, but deep enough that they can no longer stand firmly where they once did. Knowledge in stories of Baba Yaga is never free, but the price is rarely blood or life. What is taken is the ability to belong without doubt. Once a person has seen that the world is wider and more complex than the village frame allows, returning to live as if there is only one acceptable way of understanding becomes impossible. Not out of rebellion, but because full belief is no longer available to them. The community senses this before the individual fully understands it themselves. In such villages, shared belief is the thread that binds people together. When one person falls out of rhythm, the thread does not snap immediately. It slackens. The looks directed toward them change, not hostile, but cautious, not rejecting, but distant. They are still greeted, still called by name, but no longer asked to weigh in on matters that shape the whole. Gradually, they drift toward the edges of communal life. No one forces this. There are no declarations, no punishments. The movement happens naturally, the way water seeks the lowest ground. In many stories, those who once entered Baba Yaga's forest move closer to the village's edge, where the trees grow thicker and houses thin out. Not because they wish to return to the forest, but because there they no longer have to pretend they still fit seamlessly among the rest. Some try to reclaim their former lives. They attend festivals, repeat rituals, and perform what is expected. But the effort carries exhaustion. Every familiar gesture becomes a reminder that they are playing a role. Once the structure behind the order has been seen, believing in it as before would require a forgetting they are no longer capable of. Baba Yaga does not instruct, but she does not deceive either. What she gives is exactly what was asked for. Humans simply fail to grasp the consequences of their request. The knowledge she grants does not make them obviously stronger or wiser. It isolates them, not because they rise above others, but because they no longer stand on the same ground. In closed social systems, such difference breeds unease. A person who no longer fears what the community fears, who no longer believes what the community believes, becomes unpredictable. And what is unpredictable, even if not dangerous, is kept at a distance. Over time, these individuals fade from the village's shared story, not because they die, but because they are no longer told. They stop appearing in new legends, are not remembered as examples or warnings. They exist but at the margins of collective memory. A quiet kind of life too different to merge back in, yet not dramatic enough to become myth. In these stories, Baba Yaga does not need to appear again. The consequences of the meeting are enough to continue on their own. Those who leave the forest carry a truth they cannot fully pass on and cannot set aside. What is exchanged is not humanity itself, but simplicity, the ability to live in a world with only one layer of meaning. Some people are not cursed, not punished, not cast out. They simply can no longer live as if everything were still clear and complete. And from that moment on, even as they stand on familiar paths, among familiar faces, they have already begun to leave the community, slowly, silently, so quietly, that even they do not realize how far they have gone. After those who leave Baba Yaga's forest, carrying knowledge that no longer fits Eastern European folklore, turns toward a different fear. No longer a marked individual, no longer a soul trapped between worlds, but something that spreads without preference, without dialogue, without mercy. Disease, and in a desperate attempt to understand what could not be seen, people gave it a face. Nosferatu does not appear as a solitary monster. He does not hide deep in the forest or stand guard at the village's edge. Nosferatu arrives alongside the stench of decay, the sealed houses, the church bells ringing, not to call the faithful, but to announce the dead. When illness spreads and no cause can be found, people cannot accept that death arrives at random. It must be carried by someone. In centuries before medicine had names for bacteria or viruses, disease was understood as a being with intent. It moved. It chose its victims. It punished. And Nosferatu became the face of that fear, not to explain sickness, but to make it something that could be hated, hunted, and destroyed. Unlike the Strigoi or the Rusalka, Nosferatu is rarely portrayed as a loved one returning. He is often an outsider even in life, a hoarder during famine, a profiteer when food was scarce, a trader who passed through more homes than anyone else while illness spread. When the plague arrived, the community's gaze instinctively turned toward these figures, not because they were proven guilty, but because they stood at the center of contact. In folk records, Nosferatu does not need to bite to spread disease. His presence alone is enough. He passes through, and people fall ill. He stands near a doorway, and days later, the household burns with fever. No one sees transmission, but everyone sees the result. And in collective fear, results always demand a culprit. Nosferatu is described as decayed, yet not fully dead. Gray skin, bloated flesh, long nails, darkened lips. These traits are not accidental. They mirror the familiar sight of plague victims' bodies that did not decompose, normally corpses buried hastily without proper rites, without time for the village to believe they had truly departed. As deaths multiply, the community needs a stopping point, not for the disease, but for the panic. Nosferatu provides it. He turns an invisible threat into a tangible object, a body that can be exhumed, a heart that can be pierced, a name that can be cursed. Notably, Nosferatu is rarely seen as completely foreign. He is usually someone who once lived among them, traded with them, crossed familiar thresholds. That familiarity deepens the terror. The disease does not come from outside, it comes from within the community itself. And Nosferatu becomes the means by which the contaminated is separated from the rest. In many stories, destroying Nosferatu is not merely a defense, but a purification. The body is unearthed, burned, and its ashes scattered beyond the village limits, not only to prevent his return, but to declare that the sickness has been expelled from the social boundary. That boundary, though symbolic, allows people to believe order can be restored. In this role, Nosferatu is not the cause of disease, but the vessel for every fear surrounding it. Greed, selfishness, and indifference during a crisis are condensed into a single form. When food is hidden, when the elderly and children die first, when survival becomes scarce, the community needs to believe such behavior is not only immoral, but existentially dangerous. This is why Nosferatu is so often linked to hoarding profiteering, and those who survive too long while the village withers. He does not merely carry illness, he represents the unsettling fact that someone lived better than others while everything collapsed. And to the community that is more terrifying than the disease itself, this personification offers a warped comfort. If sickness has a face, it can be resisted. If death has a name, it is no longer entirely random. Nosferatu allows people to believe catastrophe has logic, even if that logic is built on fear and judgment. Over time, Nosferatu's image blurs and transforms. He leaves the specific village and becomes a broader symbol of plague, decay, and death that moves, but his roots remain. In communities that watched entire villages disappear within a few seasons, finding someone to blame was the only way to keep living. Nosferatu does not teach humanity how to cure disease. He teaches how to endure fear. By gathering it, giving it shape, and believing that when the shape is destroyed, the threat will fade as well. Even if reality is rarely that simple. But on nights when coughing echoes behind every door, when candles are lit, not for prayer, but for vigilance, that belief is the only thing keeping the community from dissolving entirely. Nosferatu exists not because people were ignorant, but because they needed a way to go on living amid helplessness. The disease eventually passes, but its memory remains. And within that memory, Nosferatu still walks, carrying a cold lesson. Some fears are too vast to exist without form. And when humans face mass death, what they seek is not only medicine, but an explanation for who people became when everything fell apart. When disease no longer kills one household at a time, but begins to engulf the entire village, fear changes shape. It no longer clings to a single name, a grave, or a suspected body. It spreads into glances, into whispers, into the way people look at one another while standing in the same space. And from that moment on, Nosferatu no longer needs to appear. Panic itself becomes enough to function on its own. In later folk records, Nosferatu gradually dissolves into another concept. Bies, not a separate creature, but a condition, a state of collective madness where individual reason melts into shared terror. The question is no longer who carries the sickness, but who has not yet been suspected. Bies does not require a clear form. It exists through the unspoken agreement of the entire village. When a belief is shared widely enough, it no longer needs evidence. Every action is interpreted through the same lens. A cough is simply an illness, but when fear takes hold, a cough becomes a sign. A closed door is just a habit, but during panic, it becomes concealment. Fear begins to replicate itself. Each rumor gives birth to two more. Each defensive action is reinterpreted as proof of guilt. The one who burns incense must be hiding something. The one who does not burn incense is even more suspicious. There is no way to stand outside the system of interpretation. Neutrality disappears. Silence becomes the most dangerous position of all. In this state, the community functions as a single organism. No individual bears full responsibility for any decision. Every action is taken for the village. And when responsibility is shared, equally conscience dissolves, just as evenly. Acts no one would dare commit alone become possible when performed together. Rituals against Nosferatu grow more frequent. There is no longer any waiting for clear signs. No patience for observation. Any delay is treated as a threat. The newest grave becomes the starting point, not because of evidence, but because it is the simplest choice. The most recent death is always the easiest to accuse. Houses begin to be avoided, then marked, then surrounded. No one says it aloud, but everyone understands. Some doors should not be opened. Paths that should not be walked. Living space fractures along lines of fear, and that fracture quickly becomes normal. In this atmosphere, Nosferatu is no longer the cause. He becomes the excuse, an excuse that legitimizes suspicion that justifies actions, which without disease would be considered cruel. When everyone believes the same thing, it is no longer questioned. It becomes an operating truth. The most terrifying aspect of bees is not the extremity of the actions, but the sense of righteousness they carry. Those participating in the panic do not feel they are doing wrong. They feel they are doing what must be done, protecting their families, protecting the community, preserving what little order remains. In these stories, there is no clear villain. No one is portrayed as intentionally evil. Only frightened people make decisions based on the same belief, amplifying one another in the process. When everyone fears the same thing, that fear is no longer controlled by any individual. The community becomes an instrument of the very fear it created. Some villages survive the disease, but never return to what they were before, not because of how many died, but because of what happened during the panic. Houses that were once sealed, families that were avoided, names that were whispered. The illness passes, but the memory of who was suspected, who was abandoned, who was sacrificed for the common good does not. In this phase, Nosferatu is no longer a creature. He is the memory of panic itself, the trace of a moment when shared belief outweighed truth and collective fear drowned out every individual voice. He exists as a reminder that when people grant absolute authority to fear, that authority is rarely returned willingly. In the nights after the disease has faded, when the village grows quiet again, people say the residue of bees can still be felt, not through sounds or apparitions, but through lingering caution, avoided gazes, questions never asked, memories buried alongside graves that were once opened and then closed again. Panic does not need to return to cause harm. Being remembered is enough to remind us that there are moments when communities are guided not by reason nor by morality, but by a shared belief fed by fear. And when that belief takes hold of everyone, there is no one truly left outside it to bring it under control. After the panic subsides, after the disease retreats and the graves are filled again, the village believes order has returned. People begin counting the survivors, repairing roofs, reopening old paths. But one thing does not come back at the same time: nature's neutrality. In Balkan folk memory, this is the moment when Vila appears. Vila does not emerge from graveyards, nor does she carry the stench of death or the whispers of sickness. She arrives with the wind, with dark clouds gathering too quickly over the mountain peaks, with an unseasonal chill that makes livestock shiver and fields fall silent. When Vela is present, nature ceases to be a backdrop. It becomes the subject. In ancient legends, Vela is not a distant deity. She is a female spirit bound to mountains, forests, and clouds. Neither good nor evil by human standards, but acutely sensitive to what has taken place, especially to emotions compressed and left unresolved. Fear, betrayal, decisions made in panic. These things do not vanish when people stop speaking of them. They settle into the ground, the water, the air. Vila is born from that accumulation. Unlike a random storm, a Vila storm has direction. It does not destroy indiscriminately. It chooses places once abandoned, fields that were sealed off, houses that were marked. Rain does not fall evenly. Wind lashes familiar paths, as if nature remembers and responds. In folk accounts, Vila is said to dance on mountain ridges before the storm arrives. No one sees her clearly, only hears sounds like laughter woven into the wind. It is not a threat. It is a signal, a shift in state. When Vila dances, the familiar order is temporarily suspended. In these stories, nature does not react because it has been directly offended. It reacts because balance has been lost. When a community fractures itself in panic, when belief is used as a weapon, when fear becomes justification for exclusion, that imbalance radiates outward. Mountains, forests, and sky do not remain separate. The storm then is no longer weather. It becomes a decision. Wind blows, not only to fell trees, but to force people to stop. Rain falls, not only to flood, but to erase boundaries built from fear. Lightning does not strike at random. It strikes where people believed they had control. In villages that survive disease, Vila often comes last, not to punish, but to remind. When people believe the threat has been destroyed, that Nosferatu has been burned, that panic has ended, Vila appears to show that consequences do not end with an imagined culprit. What makes Vila frightening in these stories is that humans cannot negotiate with her. No ritual reliably drives her away. No plea that guarantees safety. Vila does not respond to words. She responds to states of being. As long as unresolved memory lingers within the community, nature remains unstable. In some legends, survivors of the storm describe sensing Vila as a watching consciousness, not hostile, but not indifferent, as if humanity is no longer the center of the story, only one element within a larger system where actions leave echoes beyond social boundaries. The storm has memory because nature keeps what humans try to forget. Repeated crop failures, landslides striking places once torn by conflict streams, changing course after a season of sickness. All are read as signs, not of personal punishment, but of a system correcting itself. When humans break the balance among themselves, nature does not stand aside, it participates. Vila, therefore, is not an enemy. She is evidence that humans are no longer central. In this world, nature does not exist to serve or endure. It responds, and that response does not need to be fair by human moral standards. After the storm, the village changes, not loudly like a disease, not violently like panic, but quietly. Roads are erased, old boundaries washed away. People are forced to move differently, plant differently, and live differently. Not out of fear of Vila, but from the understanding that some forces are indifferent to human intention and respond only to collective condition. In the stories passed down, Vila does not appear often. She comes only when necessary, when human confidence exceeds its limits, when the village believes it has survived everything and can return to what it was. That is when the wind begins to shift. No one says Vila comes to teach. Yet after every storm, the community understands its place more clearly, not as a master, but as a temporary inhabitant, not as the center, but as a part that can be adjusted. And in the silence after the storm, when clouds break and the air grows heavy with wet earth, people realize the greatest fear is not nature's anger, but the moment nature stops being neutral. When that happens, every human action, no matter how small, leaves a trace, not only in collective memory, but in the world itself. After Vila's storm passes, when the ground is still damp and the air is heavy with the scent of wet moss, people return to what they believe is the safest place of all: the home. Familiar walls, repaired roofs, the hearth lit once more. There is no violent wind or thunder, no obvious sign of an outside force. But in Slavic folk memory, this is precisely the moment when unease begins to contract inward and seep deeper. Because a house is never just an object. For centuries, people believed that every home possessed a domovoi, not a distant god nor a wandering demon. The domovoi is a presence bound to the foundation, to the wooden beams, to the warmth accumulated through generations. He is not born from death, but from life, repeated long enough within the same space. The domovoi does not need to be seen to exist. He is felt through stability, through livestock staying in their stalls, through uninterrupted sleep, through the sense that the house accepts those who live within it. When everything functions smoothly, the domovoi remains silent, and that silence is taken for granted. But the domovoi is not neutral. In folk belief, a house is a responsive being. It registers how people treat one another inside it. Words are swallowed instead of spoken, anger left unresolved, ingratitude toward the space that provides shelter. None of this disappears. It settles, accumulates, and gradually alters the state of the home itself. The disturbance does not arrive all at once. At first it is small, objects misplaced, noises at night with no clear source. Animals are growing restless. Children are struggling to sleep. No one thinks of the domovoi then. Fatigue is blamed, the weather, the lingering stress of recent disasters. But in old stories, this is when the domovoi begins to respond, not with violence, but with withdrawal. The house no longer holds the living as it once did. The air grows heavy. The hearth resists ignition. Sleep fractures. Dreams repeat themselves, vague in content, but heavy with the sense of being watched. People wake with the feeling that they never truly left the dream behind. This is where Mora appears. Mora is not the domovoi, but she is the clearest sign that the house has shifted. Mora arrives at night, in the space between sleep and waking. She has no fixed form, only weight, pressure on the chest, breath caught. The body is unable to move. Across cultures, this experience carries many names, but within the Slavic world, Mora is inseparable from a house that no longer welcomes its inhabitants. Those visited by Mora cannot scream. They cannot call for help. They can only feel the sensation that something within the familiar space is assessing their presence. Not hostile, but not inviting, as if the house itself is asking in its own way whether this person still belongs there. The domovoi does not attack directly. He does not drive people out. He simply makes the remaining uncomfortable, and that discomfort forces people to confront what they have ignored. In many legends, when families grow divided, when greed or indifference replaces care, the domovoi becomes restless, not violent, but no longer protective. The house begins to mirror the inner state of its inhabitants. Families that survived plague and panic often carry unresolved residue, decisions made in fear, people who are suspected, names that are no longer spoken. When these things are brought home and left unaddressed, the domovoi becomes their final container. And Mora is the echo of that accumulation. What makes Mora frightening is that there is no simple ritual to drive her away, unlike Nosferatu, who can be exhumed, unlike Vila, who passes with the storm. Mora fades only when the state of the home changes, when care returns, when ingratitude is acknowledged, when people remember that a house is not merely a shelter, but a relationship. In folk records, offerings are left for the domovoi, not to beg, but to acknowledge his presence. A bowl of milk, a piece of bread, placed in the corner near the hearth. This gesture is not a simple superstition. It is a reminder that living space itself demands respect. When that respect is forgotten, the domovoi does not grow angry. He simply stops helping. The house then is no longer a place of recovery after catastrophe. It becomes an amplifying mirror. Every exhaustion sharper. Every unease is louder. Nights stretch longer. Sleep turns into dangerous territory. Not because something has entered from outside, but because balance within has already been lost. In these stories, the domovoi is not evil. He is loyal to the house, not to the people. When humans no longer live in harmony with the space that shelters them, the domovoi chooses the other side. Not to punish, but to respond honestly. And that is what deepens the fear. Because people can leave the forest. They can wait out the storm. They can hunt disease, but they cannot easily leave their home. The place of refuge ceases to be neutral and becomes an active participant in their survival. After everything that has happened from the dead, who did not depart to disease, that walked to nature, that answered back the domovoi, marks another shift. Fear no longer waits outside. It lives within the most familiar space of all. And when the house begins to respond, people are forced to ask whether the place they rely on still stands with them or is merely reflecting everything they have carried inside. When the house no longer offers absolute shelter, people are forced to look outward. And what they see after the domovoi is not the village, but the forest. Once again, the forest does not exist as a backdrop. It stands there unmoving, dense like a space that has never been fully domesticated. In Slavic folk memory, this is where Leshy exists. Leshy is not a monster. He does not feed on human death, does not appear after plague or panic. He exists alongside humanity, older than the village, older than the paths, cut through tree trunks. In these stories, the forest is not wild territory. It is a system with memory, with agency, and Leshy is the embodiment of that authority. Stories of Leshy often begin quietly. No screams, no violence, just a child wandering off. A step taken too far from the path. A moment of distraction. The forest does not close like a door. It simply expands beyond what is expected enough for the person inside to lose certainty about where they are going. People say that Leshy does not abduct children. He keeps those whom the forest recognizes, not because they are weak, but because they are not yet fully bound. Children in this worldview do not completely belong to the village. They still hear other rhythms, and the forest, if it chooses, can keep them without force. Children held by the forest do not vanish forever. Some return, but the return is never complete. They cannot explain what happened, not because of fear, but because there is no language for it. Time in a forest does not move like time in the village. An afternoon can stretch into days or collapse into moments. When they come back, these children are different, not dramatically, but enough for parents to notice. They no longer fear the dark in the same way. They no longer draw clear lines between play and danger. Their gaze lingers too long on the tree line, as if listening to something adults cannot hear. In folk records, Leshy is not described as evil. He shifts form, sometimes as tall as a tree, sometimes as small as another child. He mimics familiar voices to lead wanderers deeper, not to kill, but to blur boundaries. Anyone who goes far enough no longer knows where they belong. The forest does not keep everyone. It chooses. That choice is not based on morality or fairness. It is based on compatibility. Some people enter the forest and return immediately. Some walk it their entire lives without ever becoming lost. But others, especially children, are recognized by the forest as something unfinished, something that still resonates with it. The fear in these stories is not that the forest takes people, but that it can give them back, not whole. Children who return carry part of the forest within them, not magic, but a shift in being. They no longer fully belong to the human order. The village tries to pull them back through discipline, through ritual, through warnings that the forest is dangerous, but the words slide past. Not in defiance, but because they have seen that the forest is not only a threat. It is another space, one where rules do not need to be spoken. In communities that live close to the forest, this is accepted. Not every child who returns can be corrected. Some grow up carrying that misalignment, becoming quiet adults loosely attached, often disappearing into the woods and then coming back. They are not fully rejected, but they are never fully trusted. The boundary between human and nature in these cases becomes unclear. Leshy does not erase it. He only makes it indistinct. When people are no longer sure where they belong, they become easier to keep, not through force, but through a new familiarity. The forest in this role does not oppose the village. It exists in parallel. It remains as another option, always present, always waiting. Leshy does not tempt with promises. He simply reveals that there is a way of living that does not require a human structure. After the domovoi, when the house responds and forces people to confront inner instability, Leshy expands the story outward. If a home can turn away, the forest can keep, without reason, without explanation. And that is what deepens the fear. Adults understand that Leshy cannot be negotiated with. No ritual guarantees the forest will return what it holds. All they can do is teach children to respect boundaries, even as they know those boundaries are not fixed. They shift with time, with condition, with forces beyond control. In the stories that endure, Leshy does not arrive to end a disaster. He exists as a constant reminder that humans are not the world's only center. Some spaces do not belong to them, even if they pass through them every day. And some beings require no human permission to choose. The forest keeps what it chooses, not out of greed, but out of nature. Just as humans keep memories, even when those memories cause pain. The difference is that the forest does not hesitate. It does not regret. It does not justify. And when a child returns from the forest, quiet or deeper, sticks carrying something the village cannot name, the community understands that some returns are only surface level. A part of that person has been kept not as a hostage, but as the result of a choice the forest made long before. The boundary between human and nature at this point is no longer a line. It is a gray zone. And within that gray zone, the story is no longer about control, but about belonging, about where one truly belongs when the village, the house, and the forest have all spoken in their own ways. Not everything the forest rejects disappears. Some things do not belong enough to be kept, yet no longer have a place to return to. They slip away from the paths, leave solid ground behind, and sink into lowlands where water does not flow onward and sound never fully carries. There time does not stop, but it no longer moves as it once did. That is how the marsh is formed. In Eastern European folk memory, the marsh is not a place of death. It is a place where things remain alive but unfinished. This landscape does not give birth to monsters through violence. It accumulates, and from that accumulation, Kikimora emerges. Kikimora does not rise from death. She is not cursed by a failed ritual, nor does she awaken to seek revenge. In most versions, Kikimora was once human, and almost always she was a woman, not because of weakness, but because she was placed into frames too narrow to contain what exceeded them. There were women in the village who could do too much for anyone to know how to name it. They wove not merely to clothe, they sang not merely to soothe, they created patterns that did not repeat forms that served no immediate survival. And it was precisely there that discomfort began. Ancient agrarian communities did not hate creativity, but they required it to have a place, to serve a function, to repeat, to merge into the shared rhythm. When art moved beyond function, it became awkward. No one forbade it. No one punished it. No one simply knew where to put it. That silence is what pushed Kikimora out of the village. No one drove her away. She left on her own, carrying what had never been named. And when there was no longer a community to reflect it, creativity did not vanish. It turned inward. It continued without witnesses. The marsh became the only environment wide enough to hold creativity, with no social position. Kikimora lives there, not as an exile, but as what remains of an order that refused her. She weaves, but not cloth for human use. She weaves light into mist patterns that exist only for moments, forms that cannot be taken away. Kikimora's creation has no use value. It exists as a process without completion, and that is precisely what makes it dangerous. Those who wander into the marsh are rarely attacked. They are held by a strange sense of familiarity. The drip of water is like the rhythm of a loom, sounds that resemble an unfinished song. Not beauty, but the sensation of being accepted without explanation. Those who linger too long share a common trait. They are people who have never found a place for the deepest part themselves. The young artisan was deemed odd, the woman who speaks too little, the maker of things that are beautiful but not appropriate. Kikimora does not call them. She exists as a space where such things are not questioned. But no community is neutral. When creativity is not reflected, it is not guided. It grows according to its own logic. Anyone who remains in the marsh too long loses the ability to return to the old rhythm of life. Not because they are imprisoned, but because they have grown accustomed to not having to explain who they are. When they return to the village where everything requires a name, they fall out of sync. No one says they are wrong, but no one understands them either. And that misalignment slowly removes them from communal life, even as they remain physically present. Kikimora, then, is not a personal curse. She is the result of a community that does not know what to do with difference. When talent is not recognized, it does not die. It finds another environment, and that environment is no longer designed for humans. There is no ritual to hunt Kikimora, no attempt to destroy her. People simply avoid the marsh. They teach their children not to follow light in the mist, not to stop for sounds without a clear source. Not because it is evil, but because it is a place from which one does not return intact. After Leshy, where the forest chooses whom it keeps, Kikimora appears as the other side of the same logic. Not chosen, but forgotten. Not taken, but left behind. And in that prolonged abandonment, creativity becomes environment, and environment becomes warning. The marsh reflects the sky, but offers no exit. Creativity there continues unnamed, unused, yet never gone. A quiet reminder that talent, when it has nowhere to belong, does not destroy itself. It builds a world of its own, and that world may no longer have room for humans as they once understood themselves. The marsh keeps what has been forgotten, but some things do not drift away, do not sink, do not dissolve into water and mist. They remain beneath cold earth, so heavy they cannot be moved, not because they were forgotten, but because they were held too tightly. In northern lands where winters stretch long and the ground hardens like stone, people learned early that death is not always an ending. Not because the soul is too strong, but because attachment is too heavy. From this understanding, Draugr enters collective memory as a possibility that always exists, waiting for the right conditions to surface. Draugr is not born from injustice. He was not wrongly killed, not betrayed, not bound by an unresolved curse. What holds him in place is not emotion, but possession. Objects buried with him. Property is treated as an extension of the self. The belief that what is mine should not end with a final breath. In ancient Nordic communities, the dead were often buried with weapons, jewelry, and gold, not only for use in the next world, but to affirm the status held in life. Yet this created a quiet contradiction. If death is departure, why carry along the very things that bind most tightly? Draugr is the answer to that contradiction. Stories say Draugr does not rise again. He never left. His awareness was never separated from his body. It contracted tightening around treasure, around the grave, around boundaries established long before death. His flesh does not decay like others. It hardens, grows heavier, as if earth and frost have merged with bone and skin. A Draugr's grave is never at rest. Snow melts there faster. Stones shift. Soil pushes upward so slowly that it is almost imperceptible unless watched over time. Without ever seeing him stand, people know that something beneath is refusing to release its grip. Draugr does not wander far from his burial mound. He does not hunt at random. He guards. Not the community, but the perimeter of ownership. The wealth buried with him becomes the center of an invisible exclusion zone. Animals avoid it. Travelers detour, not merely out of fear, but from the sense that death has failed to complete its task there. In this case, wealth is no longer material. It is a memory of power, the residue of decisions once enforced in life. Draugr clings to these traces as he clings to himself, not because they still serve a function, but because nothing else remains to define him once life has ended. Unlike restless spirits born of grievance, Draugr cannot be appeased. No prayer persuades him to depart. There is no wound to heal, no injustice to correct. There is only one attachment that must be severed. In the legend's ending, a Draugr does not mean killing him. It means removing what binds him. Treasure must be unearthed. Weapons broken. Objects marked by ownership were destroyed or scattered, not as punishment, but so death can proceed. Yet this act is never simple. It forces the community to confront its most uncomfortable question. Who truly owns these things, the dead or the living who still revere the authority they represent? In this way, Draugr is not merely a restless corpse, but a symbol of an order that refuses to end. In many tales, Draugr vanishes only when wealth is returned to the community or destroyed entirely. When there is nothing left to guard, his body collapses, not like a defeated enemy, but like a structure stripped of its foundation. Only then does death complete itself. After Kikimora, where forgotten creativity becomes a dangerous environment, Draugr represents the opposite extreme. Not neglect, but excess attachment. Not abandonment, but refusal to let go. Both lead to the same result. Death fails to fulfill its function. Draugr reminds us that some people do not remain because they are wronged, but because they never learned how to release. When death arrives, instead of opening another passage, it tightens chains forged long before. Wealth, in this case, does not offer safety. It becomes the weight that pulls everything downward. In cold regions where burial grounds lie close to living spaces, people gradually learned to bury lightly, to carry little, to avoid placing deeply bound objects in the grave, not from fear of Draugr as a monster, but from understanding that some things should end with life, not be dragged into death. On long northern nights, when the wind passes over burial mounds and snow erases all tracks, Draugr remains as a collective memory, not to terrify, but to remind that life is measured not only by breath, but by the ability to leave at the right time, and that some things, if not released while living, will hold a person in place longer than any life ever could. Some remain because they cling to possessions, but others stay because they discover another form of existence. After Draugr, where death refuses to release what is anchored by ownership, the story slips into a darker territory. Here it is no longer the dead who refuse to leave, but the living who consciously abandon a portion of their humanity. There are no disturbed graves, no buried treasures, only a decision repeated in silence. The werewolf does not begin as an accident. In the oldest stories, those who become wolves are not cursed by chance. They are not victims of a bite, nor are they infected with a disease. Transformation follows a choice, a vow, a ritual, a moment when a person accepts that the strength they seek cannot coexist with familiar morality. At the edges of the village, where rules grow thin, people whisper about those who step into the forest at night, not to get lost, but to find something. They do not call it transformation, they call it release. Civilization to them is only a layer of skin, and that skin can be shed when necessary. Werewolves do not appear in stable communities. They emerge where order is stretched to the point of tearing. When laws no longer protect, when physical power becomes the final tool of survival, the beast is no longer society's opposite. It becomes an option. Folk tales rarely describe transformation as unbearable pain. Instead, it is told, in a low voice, almost calm, as if the one changing had been waiting for it, as if they were already accustomed to experiencing their body as something mutable. The power of the werewolf is not considered evil. What terrifies the community is not claws or fangs, but separation. When strength is no longer bound by ethics, it becomes unpredictable. The beast does not follow village law. It does not recognize right and wrong as humans do. And the most unsettling truth is this: the werewolf remembers who it used to be. Unlike Draugr trapped in what has already passed, the werewolf carries memory intact. They know the rules, they know the boundaries, and that knowledge makes crossing those boundaries a conscious act. Not loss of control, but suspension of control. In many legends, the werewolf does not strike at random. It targets specific threats. Intruders, disruptions of balance. At times, the community silently accepts its existence so long as the beast appears only when needed. Civilization in this sense does not destroy instinct. It contains and deploys it, but every permission carries a cost. Those who become werewolves cannot fully return. Each time the skin of civilization is shed, putting it back on becomes harder. Ethics once set aside do not return intact. The beast does not overpower the human through violence. It persuades through effectiveness. In darkness where raw strength resolves problems faster than rules, choosing the beast begins to make sense. And when that choice is repeated often enough, it no longer feels like an exception. It becomes part of the unseen structure that allows the community to endure. The werewolf, then, is not a destroyer of order. It is a byproduct of order pushed beyond its limits. When civilization is no longer thick enough to shield people from fear, the thin skin tears and what lies beneath is exposed. Stories say the werewolf appears only on certain nights, not because the moon forces it, but because those are the moments when the community looks away. When no one is watching, choosing the beast becomes easier, not from shame, but from the absence of justification. The beast does not need reasons. It does not need to explain itself. It acts. And in a world where action produces faster results than words, the beast gradually gains advantage. What sets the werewolf apart from all other figures is unspoken consent. Draugr is feared. Kikimora is avoided. Leshy is respected at a distance. But the werewolf exists in a gray zone of allowance, neither celebrated nor fully hunted. Simply not spoken of too loudly, because naming it too clearly would force the community to face an uncomfortable truth. The beast is not created from outside, it is permitted from within. When people accept that there are situations where rules are too slow, too weak, they open the door for instinct to step forward. Civilization seen this way is not a fixed state. It is a fragile agreement, a skin worn each day. And every night that skin can be peeled away for a moment, as long as morning allows the pretense that it was never removed. The werewolf reminds us that the boundary between human and beast is not drawn by biology. It is drawn by choice, and that choice does not always arrive in panic. Sometimes it comes calmly, rationally, necessarily. When the beast is allowed to emerge, the question is no longer how to destroy it. The question becomes who decides when it may step forward and when it must disappear. And if no one truly controls that decision, then the skin of civilization that people pride themselves on may be far thinner than they ever believed. After the beast comes silence, not the silence of forests, of storms, or of graves, but the silence of houses that have witnessed too much and are no longer listened to. When the werewolf fades back into the edge of darkness, when instinctive strength is put away like a tool that has served its purpose, people return to the most familiar space they know, the home, the place they believe is safe, the place they believe remains under their control. And it is there that what has been forgotten begins to speak. Poltergeist does not appear in deep forests, rivers, or distant burial grounds. It manifests in ordinary life, in kitchens, hallways, and bedrooms. It requires no grotesque form, only a chair slightly moved a knock, with no source, an object falling for no reason at all. Unlike Strigoi or Draugr, the poltergeist has no clear body. It does not hunt. It does not kill directly. What makes it unsettling is its familiarity. It does not come from outside. It has been there all along. In Eastern European folk, belief restless spirits are not necessarily evil. Many legends emphasize that they do not seek destruction. They seek remembrance, acknowledgement, to be named. In these stories, the house is not inert. It stores memory. Every argument is swallowed instead of resolved. Every death is not mourned long enough. Every word left unspoken. When people leave, memory does not leave with them. It settles into walls, floors, and air. The poltergeist is the expression of memory that was never processed. Here, the connective thread becomes clear. Mora pressing down on the sleeper when fear is never spoken. Domovoi reacts when gratitude is forgotten. Strigoi return when bonds of death are never fully severed. All revolve around the same core idea, living space, as a being that contains unfinished relationships. Mora weighs on the chest when fear has no voice. Domovoi disrupts when care is withdrawn. Strigoi returns when death is not fully accepted. The poltergeist is the final stage, when no other figure remains suitable to carry the story forward. In many early records, poltergeist activity centers around a young person, not because they cause it, but because they are most sensitive to it. When pressure builds, when families remain silent too long, something must release, and that release does not need to take a rational shape. Knocks, flying objects, whispers. These are not clear messages. They are signals, clumsy attempts by things that no longer have language. What is notable is that poltergeists rarely kill. They disrupt. They erode the sense of safety. They force acknowledgement that something remains unresolved, not through violence, but through persistence. The house becomes a mirror, not of faces, but of history. What was hidden, ignored, and dismissed as insignificant now demands to be seen. And when belief in spirits fades, the poltergeist does not disappear. It simply changes names. Stress, trauma, disorder. The structure remains the same. A system that cannot withstand the weight of buried memory indefinitely. In this narrative, the poltergeist is not the most dramatic climax, but it is the final convergence point, where all prior entities meet. No forest, no grave, no river. Only the space humans build and cannot easily abandon. The legends do not end in victory. There is no ritual of absolute eradication. Poltergeist activity often subsides only after acknowledgement, a name spoken correctly, a death remembered. A relationship is put back into place. Not every spirit needs to be expelled. Some only need to be recognized as having existed. And here the story closes not with terror, but with a colder realization. These legends did not exist because they were wrong. They existed because once they were the only way humans could understand the world. Before science people told stories, before language for trauma, they named demons. Before understanding how collective memory operates, they believed spirits stayed behind. Monsters are not born from darkness. They are born from humanity's desperate effort to explain what lies beyond its control. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is not that these legends were once believed. It is that even after changing names and languages, they have never truly disappeared. Because wherever memory is forgotten, something will always find a way to speak.